Cool. All right. Thanks for joining, Matthew, and whoever joins in later. I'm super excited to introduce Ryan and Brandy, who are co-founders of Kitcaster, which is a podcast agency. And don't know much about them. I've met them for the first time, but I'm very excited to hear from their own words how they started Kitcaster and the workshop that they're going to lead us through today. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan and Brandy.
Cool, Harshit, I really appreciate it. Brandy and I are co-founders of Kitcaster. In a nutshell, Kitcaster books entrepreneurs on top podcasts. We work almost exclusively with funded startup founders, entrepreneurs with exits, and C-suite executives, and we book them on the world's top podcasts, and that's all we do. I guess it's to caveat, that's not all we do, as a matter of fact. Part of what we do is prepare them for podcasts. We have what we call storycraft sessions, which is a little bit about what we're going to do today. What else, Brandy?
Yeah, so podcasts are interesting. It's a really cool medium to tell your story and really dive into what it is that you do that drives you personally and tying it into what you do professionally. So that is really in story crafting and what we do through Kitcaster, prepping people before they go on a podcast tour, really tightening that story. What is your narrative? What's your purpose? Why do you get up in the morning? What drives you? That's what podcast hosts and listeners want to hear. They don't want a 60-minute advertisement about your company. They want to know about you. What drives you? Where have you fallen? Where have you pulled yourself back up? Have you had multiple businesses? What did that look like? Did you have successful exits? Did you fail in a couple and reinvent yourself? So that's really what we're going to be working on today, is crafting that story so that you can show up to a podcast interview and be very prepared to say something interesting, not just read your resume.
Totally agree. There's what I love about podcasting is kind of a charming amateurism. And kind of what almost all podcast hosts do is they'll have you on as a guest and they'll start the conversation by saying, Brandy, tell us a little bit about yourself. And if you're like me, then when somebody asks me that, I go completely blank and I can't remember my middle name or where I grew up or anything. So being put on the spot is a little bit challenging. So what we're going to do with this workshop is to go over that first 5 minutes of an interview. And I'll use this deck to kind of keep me on track. So if you want me to slow down or go back to anything, I'm happy to do that. So really, the reason why it's important to think of our narrative, as Brandy pointed out, is because this is what hooks an audience early. If you got a 60-minute conversation, you got a couple of minutes that people are going to determine whether they like you and whether they're going to stick around and listen to what you got to say. So we want to deliver really well in the first 5 to 6 minutes. And hopefully this workshop will kind of shed some light on that. Let's go to the next slide here. Here we go. Okay, so with this workshop, you'll end the session with 6 personal anecdotes, at least, that will quickly hook the audience, create interest and intrigue, attract your ideal clients, if that's the outcome you're looking for, and definitely build confidence and clarity. We'll kind of move on here. What you'll need to complete the workshop. If you've got sticky notes, awesome, we'll use them. If you don't, that's okay. You can use Trello board, which is a digital sticky board, or sticky tabs, sticky notes, sticky, or just a piece of paper, to kind of like put ideas down. The idea is you can kind of move them around. That's why sticky notes are kind of cool, because that'll come in handy. And this is kind of the progress that we'll go through. So step 1, we're going to talk about, your age, your accomplishments, and who you are as a person. So these are uncomfortable things to mention and oftentimes might be considered rude. So we have some tips and techniques to kind of help you through that process. Step 2, we'll talk about 3 specific stories that are always interesting to people, which is your humble beginning story, the pivotal moment that that got you to change what you're doing and do something new, and then the vision for the future. At the end, if there's enough folks here, then what we'll do is you can use these stories and we'll practice a little bit introducing ourselves using these stories, and there'll be a little time for Q&A too. Anything you want to elaborate here, Brandy?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, the whole concept behind what we're doing here is to connect with people, right? So we as humans, we connect through stories, whether that be binging a Netflix series, listening to a podcast series, reading a good book. Like, we're drawn in by stories. So the idea is to have you walk away from the session with at least the beginning stages to a story that we can build out. And this doesn't necessarily just have to be used for podcasts. You can use this as a way to communicate ideas, you know, instead of maybe telling your board what you're going to do, maybe you build a story around it. That way you invite them in and get them connected to the idea.
So true. You know, podcast is our world, and we do a lot of podcast interviews, so it helps there. But like, you know, this is a startup event, you know, if you're out there looking for fundraising opportunities, you're going to use the same techniques. You know, VCs and angels are notorious for they're not investing in products, they're investing in people. So even more pressure. You better be charming, darn it. So hopefully this helps. Or if you're interviewing for a job or you're at a cocktail party, you know, I get awkward. But our stories definitely help kind of break the ice a little bit. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit. And I know we're recording it. So for the folks that are reviewing this, we'll kind of tee this up for you as well as a workshop. You don't necessarily have to do live on, what are we on Zoom here? Okay, cool. So here's the first question, what we're going to use, which is, tell me the year you graduated high school without telling me the year you graduated high school. Okay, because one thing about talking about age is feel a little bit, as you get older, I could tell you get a little bit nervous about it. But the audience wants to know, the host wants to know, they're just not going to ask. Okay, so you can introduce yourself with kind of a story that lets them know broadly kind of how that looked. These are 3 that I used on these sticky tabs. So if you've got sticky notes in front of you, you're looking for 3 stories. You can kind of give us the abridged version just to kind of trigger these stories in your mind. So mine's dial tones. You know, I remember when phones had dial tones. I remember waking up early and fixing a bowl of cereal and watching Saturday morning cartoons. And I remember in 9th grade how heartbroken my school was when Kurt Cobain passed. You know, so if someone's like, Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself? It's like, oh man, I'm from a time that phones had dial tones, first sentence, and then you kind of move through these stories. So what we'll do through this workshop, and we've got 6 different questions like this, is we're just going to pause for, we'll call it 2.5 minutes. That'll give you an opportunity to jot down some of these stories. Let me get my clock out here. Clock, timer. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. There we go. It's running. So we can kind of think of some of these things. And again, you know, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 4. It's just things that kind of put you in a time and space as far as how old you are. Now, some people might be like super confident. You just be like, I'm 43 years old. Well, who cares? Just go for it.
But it's so much more fun to connect with people this way, right? Because if you are 43 years old and you're like, oh yeah, I remember dial tones. Absolutely. I can connect to the Saturday morning cartoons and Kurt Cobain dying. Terrible. I remember that. I remember where I was. So this is kind of part of that connection piece, that we don't just want to tell people that, hey, this is how old I am, but it's building a narrative that people can connect with.
Yeah, totally. And it makes it more fun. You know, a lot of our, you know, we deal with a lot of technical founders. You know, these are people that spend a lot of time with glowing rectangles and not necessarily with handshakes. You know, so get a little frantic, like, what's some tips? What can I do to be good on these podcasts? And I think the best you can do is just go into them with a little twinkle in your eye. You know what I mean? Like if you've
Yeah.
got some grandpa type jokes.
I think that's the beauty of podcasts. They're conversational in nature. So I always tell clients when we're doing our storycraft session that this is a 1v1. This is a conversation. This is a cup of coffee, whatever you're doing. It should be natural, but also intentional at the same time.
I
Yeah.
have a question.
Yeah.
Where did the hesitation around not saying out your age loud come from? Like, do you know what the story is? Is it because of bias?
I think it's because our culture is obsessed with youth. You know, there's this pressure. You're like, oh gosh, I'm a 43-year-old startup founder. I'm not going to make Forbes's top 20 under 20. You know, it's like everything seems to always revolve around youth culture. So I think it creates a little anxiety, a little stress.
Yeah. I also think I think we've been taught that it's rude. It's rude to ask someone's age. So, I think what Ryan referenced before is that podcast hosts aren't going to ask you, but it is kind of nice to at least point a reference to the, and really like the experience. Like, I've been doing this, like it should be a badge of honor, not something that you're ashamed of. So, but tying it in so it hits people on a more personal level.
Amen. All right, let's move on to the next one. Here we go. Tell me about your accomplishments without being overly braggy. Okay, so we all want to speak really well. You can go too far with self-deprecating humor. A little bit is always like great, but you want to be able to like deliver. People need to understand that they trust you and you're a good resource without being too braggy. So there's a couple of examples here that I'll just read these. And actually, I'll start the time if you guys want to start. So one, I spent my undergrad as a buff and a graduate as a pilgrim. Two, after I sold my second company, I wanted to do something more personally meaningful. And then three, I race vintage cars for charity. So that one probably verges. Vintage cars seems like a pretty bougie kind of hobby, but it's for charity. So you're like humble bragging, for lack of a better term.
I like that term, humble bragging. But again, the idea here is to make that personal connection, right? So that people can be like, oh yeah, I love vintage cars. Or, okay, yes, buff, I know Colorado, absolutely. I can relate to that. So again, it's just making those connections and not coming outright and saying, building a narrative, building a story.
Yeah. One thing Brandy always does that I think is really smart too is like inject statistics and numbers if you can. Like I've been to 72 countries. Just when you like use numbers, it grabs people's attention. It brings them back in. Another kind of great thing about podcasts is people just kind of have them on in the background, whether they're working or they're in traffic or whatever, and their attention wanes. So you can snap people's attention back to you by using numbers, especially big numbers. I don't know how that resonates with you guys in your stories. Got about 42 seconds on accomplishments. One thing we also do with clients is we'll use professional and personal accomplishments. It is sometimes folks will usually have a challenge with one or the other. They're like really jazzed on their product. They want to talk all about it. And then they fall flat with their own personal story, or they have this whole lifetime of amazing things they've done personally, but maybe they're feeling a little self-conscious about the product. So you can kind of toggle between the two. And again, just give people opportunity to get to know you a little bit. Or you can even confess, I'm a little uncomfortable talking about myself like this on a podcast, and then deliver anyway, but it's another way to kind of endear you to them. Okay.
It's humanizing.
Sure. Okay, we'll go to the next. 6 adjectives that describe you, and keep people wanting more. And I like the ones that Brandy started here. Why don't you give those to us, Brandy?
Oh my goodness. Well, I did this yesterday with a storycraft session actually, and I did 3 adjectives. 2, well, I needed 1 from the group that was problematic or has been problematic for you. So one of mine is competitive, which was really problematic for me as a child and through my adolescence, but has actually turned out to work really well for me. I've been able to kind of hone it in, and I'm not flipping tables when I lose a board game anymore, but I'm, but I still like see things that like make me competitive in a healthy way.
Not
So I
always.
think that's a.
I was gonna say, I know Brandy's got a history with basketball, and sometimes she talks trash. I don't know what he's walking around talking trash. Just kidding.
I try not to. But yeah, I think that is, it's things that might get that host inquisitive, right? So you're kind of talking about yourself, ways that you would describe yourself that's not like fun, but something that might just open up. Like if somebody told me that they were polarizing, I would want to know more about that. Like, tell me about that. In what ways? And that's probably been problematic for you. Share a story.
Yeah, we had a wonderful client that had this ritual. He had a padded room in his home, and he would go in there in the morning and scream affirmations and bring his son in there, scream affirmation, like literally scream. And his was, I'm going to be a billionaire. And he would just start his day screaming that in a soundproof room, which, I mean, that's an interesting adjective. How would you, Brandy, describe an adjective of a person like that? Confident?
Driven, confident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe that guy will. He's well on his way.
Yeah. Disciplined. I mean, takes some discipline to do that every single day.
A craftsman. I mean, he had to soundproof the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Help. Nice. All right. Here we go. Am I moving too fast? You guys doing okay? Rashid, I know you're doing a little bit. Is it okay?
Yep, this is great.
Okay. Okay, cool. It's we're at a pretty good clip here, but I think just to be respectful to the folks that are reviewing it, we'll do it. So sorry for the folks on the call here. Okay, cool. Next one's a little bit harder. Some of these is we're kind of going into like our past and figuring out stories. I like to just kind of free it up and just do kind of a loose association and write down many things as possible, because we can kind of get lost in retrospect. But this is describe your humble beginnings. And everyone has a humble beginning story. I mean, if you're Elon Musk's kid, maybe you're like, we had ice cream every night, but I always got served last. And that's his humble beginning story or whatever, but it's important. People want to know that the underdog come from behind story. So let's pull a couple of those out. Couple examples here. I was born a middle child of 6 kids. That kind of gives you an idea where someone's coming from. My first job was a paper route in Albuquerque. Things like this will double up. So it's both saying that, hey, I was a paper boy, paper person, pardon me, and I'm from Albuquerque, or at least I lived there. Kind of good way to transition to another story. 3, I dropped out of my freshman year of college. People love crash and burn stories. People love to hear where you've been, because everybody has them, and it just depends on where you're catching somebody. They might be in the middle of a crash, and it can be inspiring to hear somebody on the other side of it. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I think, again, podcasts provide this unique opportunity to be a little bit vulnerable. I was actually reading an article from one of our clients that he wrote about how he always compares his insides to people's outsides, which I thought was really interesting. We all do that, right? So we know what's inside of us, and we only see what's outside of other people, typically, unless you're really close with that person. So comparing what you have inside to what you can see on the outside is not always beneficial. But I think that podcasts are a really great way to take a look inside and to give people that perspective and I think we owe it to everyone to be a little vulnerable and to share stories that may not be our best times, but it's something that we learn significant things from.
Totally. And conversations are meant to be ephemeral. You know what I mean? It's like you could be taken out of context, but most of the time people are going to hear a story that makes them feel empathetic, so it's not necessarily like Instagram where you just have to always be so rosy. You can use a conversation as a place to be vulnerable and experiment with it within reason. I think that there's a line that you're comfortable with, and you should always be about 20 feet back from that line. Don't play with lines of comfort on a podcast, but flirt with what you can do and what you are comfortable with. All right. Describe a pivotal moment. Okay. Recall moments that changed your life forever. So here's a couple examples. I slipped and bumped my head while standing on the toilet to hang a clock, and I had a vision. And that vision was the flux capacitor. That's Doc Brown's pivotal moment story.
Back to the Future. So that is a good age reference, and also
funny. Exactly. You're
funny pivotal moment.
You're getting him there. But I love that one because, what's great too is like in that scene, Marty comes to the door and he's like working on his like mind reading, whatever that thing is he put on his head. So his pivotal moment wasn't the project he was actually working on. It was this other thing that he had, so pivotal moments are usually only seen in retrospect, that you look back and you're like, you know what, it was actually that time. Kind of like this hits a little home for me. I had a horrible boss. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew who I didn't want to be, which was a boss that I had, and realized that not only was I uncomfortable working for other people, but also I was uncomfortable with the tyranny of the workplace as I saw it, and wanted to make myself into somebody who wasn't like that, So again, it's something that I can see of something that was really impactful that helped shape me. And in this case, it's kind of a negative thing,
Yeah. This is the point too in the conversation when we start to bridge that personal and professional. So when you're kind of building up who you are as a person, and then we can kind of move into what we're doing professionally, what really drives us. Again, like why do we get up and come to work in the morning or do what we do? What motivates us? What's the vision? I envision a healthcare system that does X, Y, and Z. So this is where we can kind of start to bridge this all together.
Totally. Yeah, it's these are hard too. When I do this exercise, I'm like, boy, I don't know. It seems like I just stumbled into this, or it seems like everything I've done is out of sheer panic and terror. Is that a good pivotal moment? If I don't do this, what's going to happen to me? It could be. I mean, I suppose personally, I'm just looking for a more graceful way to kind of describe it. But that's valid. I don't think it always happens like Doc Brown. He's got this wonderful, amplifier in his garage that he built. It's amazing. Okay. What does this say, Harshita?
I was just saying that I agree that these are like hard questions. And I'm like trying to think like, what can I think of? And I can't think of anything. I realized like you need to reflect a little bit ahead of time and really like find those key moments or key stories, and then just practice talking out loud.
So true.
It is. And you're certainly going to stumble a bit. I have in podcast interviews. I've actually uncovered a lot of things too, where I start to like mold different stories of questions that I didn't anticipate being asked, and kind of having to work quick. And I'm like, ooh, that was good. I'm going to make note of that and I'll use it again. So it's kind of a, real time practice when you're in it and you start to think about what's connecting, and you can usually see it in the host's eyes when you've made that connection and they're shaking their head and they're connecting with what you have to say.
Yeah, it's so true. And, from our seat, we're booking people on dozens of podcasts, So by the time you've done your 30th podcast, man, this first 5-6 minutes is kind of weaponized. It's like, the beats, you got the punchlines, you got the jokes, you got all these things kind of keyed up. And then you get bored with it, so you start bringing something else in. Conversation is unique in the fact that it's malleable, and it's also it's something you can master over time. It just takes practice. Okay, cool. So, and this is kind of what our last one here is, what Brandy was alluding to, which is like your vision of the future. We've kind of spent 4 or 5 minutes here on the intro to a podcast talking about who we are, but now this is kind of like, where do you see this whole thing going? Why is the world a beautiful place? Well, it's because what you're putting into it. What are you doing now that will pay off down the road? One, we're rebuilding the nation's supply chain logistics from the ground up. That's just aspirational. I hope somebody's doing that, because I'm going crazy. Just trying to buy a new truck and couldn't. It's a little disappointing. Two, we're creating more empathetic approach to end-of-life care. Or three, we have a patented process to deliver the world's most delicious ice cream. So basically, this is what is going to be kind of the end of this beginning narrative that gives the host opportunities to ask deeper questions. Pardon me.
And I would say too, I mean, kind of thinking about the connection, right? The connective tissue and all of this, the story that you're building, is a lot of times we want to kind of call out a problem. And I talk to a lot of our clients about this. Whatever it is that they're doing right now, why are they doing it? What was broken? What were they doing previously? Maybe they had a director of marketing role and they saw the need for this place where everyone could grab content, something that you experience some sort of pain, and whether that be with like a loved one or something in your career, something personally, and then that ties into your vision, right? Like, I saw this problem, I had this experience, and I knew there was a better way to do it. So here's my vision for the future. Yeah. So thinking about it that way, I think will kind of really help flesh out how you're going to connect all of that. Like, you've got this personal story, and then kind of bringing it, and maybe it is a personal story. I'm thinking about this point too, empathetic approach to end of life care. Maybe you've witnessed something personally, and then you're able to kind of connect that solution. So thinking about it from that aspect, I think will help.
Totally. And it's like, especially when we start thinking really big, the world's first, the world's biggest, these kind of like things, it allows the idea to kind of bloom in the audience mind. It's like, okay, I see how they've gotten here and where they're going. And, now they're invested, and hopefully they're just a couple minutes into this podcast and they're going to follow it through. And on top of that, you're also kind of teeing up the host for some really good deeper diving questions. Okay. Boom. That's it. What we'll do now, there's just a few of us here. So I think what we'll do is do another 2.5 minutes and start to maybe see if there's a way to piece together some of these stories in a way that makes sense and feels good. If you're on sticky notes, you can literally be like, okay, here's my age story that I like. Here's my pivotal moment story, something that feels natural to you. And then what we can do at the end would be introduce yourself. There's only a couple of us here, so maybe we could mix and kind of finish the podcast or this session out with introduce yourself using your stories if you'd like to, if you want to play around with that, or just kind of Q&A. And Brandy's going to be nice enough to kind of wrap up Q&A as I got another commitment. But does that sound good, Brandy?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, if people are willing to share, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the story that they've built, because I know that that's a lot, and we did it all in 15 minutes. So if you want to share, would love to hear it. But if you don't, I'm just here to answer questions, and you can really throw anything at me in regards to podcasting.
Cool.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brandy. Thank you, Harshita.
Thank you,
Appreciate being
Ryan.
part of it. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for Dan.
Yeah, and feel free to type in the chat, speak up, let me know kind of what direction you want to move here. We can be pretty flexible. What would be most helpful? Is anybody ready to share a story? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I have bits of them ready, but I'm gonna see if Matthew or Adam want to go first. I talk too much.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to go through my story, but I do appreciate, kind of the structure of telling a story. I'm gonna go with the advice that you gave in the beginning to, be prepared before you do something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do appreciate the structure of kind of telling these stories, being deliberate on what you want to do as far as expressing who you are and what your company's going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, this was an exercise just to kind of get you thinking in that direction. Whatever you came up with through the various slides and prompts, it may not be what you lead with, but it was at least something to kind of get you thinking that way of how you're going to put it all together. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, kind of the notes that I have jotted down here are kind of, the tips that you guys give, and the examples too were really good. As far as like a Q&A,
Yeah.
what are other things besides, what's the determining factor of deciding if you think that you should go on a podcast? I feel like there's a lot out there. Do you have any kind of like filter suggestions on how it applies to your business or something along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm going to pull out of my pocket one of my statistics that I use. So there are 2.6 million podcasts in production. So there are a ton of shows, and I would highly recommend you go on a podcast because it's fun and it's just a good way to start to practice those skills. And it doesn't have to be, we're not saying to go on Tim Ferriss's podcast or How I Built This. I mean, it could be, I would start with your expertise. What is it that you do? Thinking about some of the things that you feel really comfortable talking about. That could be something that you're just passionate about, or it could be something that is related to your career. So, if you're a CFO, there are tons of CFO podcasts. So you could just go on and kind of talk about, maybe there's a couple things that you think are really important to how you operate. And when you want to reach out to a podcast, you want to sell a conversation, not your business or your role, but like, what are you going to bring? What are you going to bring to the listeners? So thinking about, all right, so these are the three areas, these are the three categories that I think would be really interesting for me to pursue. Maybe it's like CFO podcast, parenting, and then let's say technology. And so and you can even go dig a little bit further in those categories, but then whatever you decide, determine what you're going to bring to the conversation. So maybe there's like three points that you hey, really respect your show. I would love to be a guest. Here are some things that I think would be interesting for us to chat about if I were to come onto your show. What do you think? So that's just I think the best way to approach that. And when you start to really kind of narrow in on the podcast that you're interested in being a guest on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that answers my question as far as, how to pick and choose. Sounds like as long as it's something that's, in line with your business or in line with, your personal kind of goals, it's something that's worthwhile to go and speak about.
Yeah. And honestly, I've heard from so many of our clients, especially those who are kind of starting out, it really helps them identify their key talking points. Because when you're finished with that podcast, you're going to have a really good sense of how well it went. And you can also ask the host, just like, hey, how do you think that went once they push the stop record button? And there's, the call doesn't end there. There's usually some pleasantries exchanged after that. So ask them, just say, how did that go? What do you think? What are the things that I said that really resonated? Would you have liked me to elaborate further on something? And that way you can get some real candid feedback, and it also will help you just be able to talk more, provide more clarity around how you talk about your business. I think especially now people have, there's just so many different career paths and with new technologies that are coming to the forefront, and sometimes it's hard and complex to describe what you do. I think you get really good at being able to pare that down and deliver it pretty succinctly. Any other questions?
Along the same lines, like I guess like when you're a founder or an entrepreneur, how much does quantity of being on podcasts matter, or as opposed to quality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say that when you are just starting out and maybe kind of building your persona, building your brand, I would say quantity over quality. Especially as you're just starting to, you're certainly gonna go on interviews that are not gonna go as planned and not be maybe your finest performance. So, I always say like lower impact podcasts when you're first starting, just to kind of flush out and work out some of those narratives and get comfortable. Because you have nerves. You think that you'll go on and everything will flow just seamlessly. But as that time, like let's say you have, 10 a.m. on a Wednesday scheduled to go on this podcast, and it's 9:30 and your nerves are bouncing and your heart's pumping, and you're kind of walking through your talking points. It kind of settling in and getting a few underneath your belt so that you understand the typical flow, I think is really important. And then as you become more established, I think then looking at some higher quality.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Adam, do you have any questions?
Sure. I guess one of the ones that I've always thought on this sort of thing, because I'm conversational in person, but when it gets to recording things, canonicalizing things on the internet, and I do software development, so I'm used to seeing all the dark corners of the internet and what people try and do with it and all of that. So what thoughts do you have as far as, or kind of like warnings or cautions or precautions rather to take as far as when you do get into podcasting and doing those things? How do you kind of, what are the mistakes to avoid up front and kind of plan ahead for some of that as you begin building that brand persona online, or any kind of guidelines there?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important piece to all of this, is because it is evergreen.
Yeah, the internet does not forget, and it's not friendly.
So true. So true. We actually were just talking about this today in a team meeting, because you have to be very mindful of how you're communicating, and even just some language that's used that maybe isn't necessarily something that you'd want to use today. Maybe it was acceptable 20 years ago, but it is no longer acceptable for you to say. So being knowledgeable and kind of what the expectations are there. You can certainly go off, right? Because they're so conversational in nature and you get comfortable, you're like settling in, you feel really good about the conversation you're having with the podcast host, you get on a topic and you just start riffing. And that can be problematic. You could take a perfectly great interview and unravel it in 7 seconds. So that's one of the pieces that I talk about during my storycraft session, is to avoid that stray, right? Like, yes, you want to show people who you are, but be mindful that this is still an interview, it's a conversation, and people are going to be listening to it. So don't go too far, making sure that you're pausing, allowing the host to still, it's their job to control the conversation. So if you're talking about something, you're talking really fast and you're just not giving yourself a break to pause, and you could easily go down a path that you can never get back. So that's always been one of my key tips, is to slow down, pause, pay attention to cues, You'll see it in the host's eyes if you've gone too far. They're trying to get control back. You'll be able to sense that. Also, just knowing that it's hard to know when people will be listening to this podcast episode, right? So when you're thinking about however you're using the interview, and maybe you're announcing a product update or a launch, well, you could have recorded that in 2020, right? And you're like, oh, next week we're launching our 2.0 version. Well, give some context to that. So that when people are listening, they're not always going to check the date of when that episode aired. So just be mindful and give some context to when that time frame is, and maybe like knowing that just because you recorded this podcast, they might not publish it next week. They could publish it in a month, in 2 months. So just some things to be mindful of when it comes to the actual recording.
I was thinking about that specifically regarding the point about numbers and stats and things, and those are very good to have, but without the context, like, oh, I have this many million users on my site, and then 5 years from now, suddenly it's not a big number anymore. And without the context,
Yeah.
it'd be hard to know where some of the stats can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I think making some sort of reference, and, maybe that's something that's happening that's like relevant that somebody can associate with, like something in the news cycle, or, being able to connect a piece like that to the conversation can be helpful too. Yeah, great. Any other questions? Wonderful. All right.
Thank you
Well,
so
that's
much
it.
for your time, Brandy. This was awesome.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And if you have any additional questions, anybody that's tuning in either now or at another time, just reach out to me. My email is Brandy, BRANDY at Kitcaster, KITCASTER. And I'm happy to connect, do a quick Zoom call, whatever you need. I'm here for any sort of questions or conversation.
Awesome.
Thank
Great.
you. Good
Thank you.
information.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Take
All
care.
right. Take care. Yep. You
Bye.
too. Bye-bye.